He is paranoid and probably rightly so. The fact that he has to kind of go begging to Trump, Russia looks very weak. They aren't achieving their objectives in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian deep strike campaign, the Ukrainian middle strike campaign is embarrassing the Russians. He is paranoid and probably rightly so about the capability of the Ukrainian drone program, which has proved, exceptionally potent over the last few days. We've seen strikes against oil refineries, and today we saw, last night we saw a strike against the Perm pumping station, deep within Russia, about 1,300 kilometers inside Russia. So, you're seeing the reach of this Ukrainian drone program, and the Russians really don't seem to have an answer to it. We've seen Peskov talking today about how Russia is attempting to persuade Ukraine to agree to a ceasefire on May the 9th so that the Russians can have their parade in peace. I don't think that's going to be particularly attractive to the Ukrainians, because why would you agree to stop the war for 24 hours just so Putin can have his little parade in Red Square? It seems for Ukraine, there's not really that much benefit there. But yeah, it's humiliating, and it's especially humiliating when you consider this was a war that Russia expected to win within weeks, possibly at most months. And here we are entering the fifth year of this war, and they are really no closer to victory than they were, a couple of weeks after the invasion began. He obviously he brought up this idea in this 90-minute phone call that Putin and Trump had yesterday. Um, Again, I don't think this is going to be particularly appetizing for the Ukrainians. Why would they agree to a ceasefire for 24 hours just so Putin can have his parade? It doesn't seem like Ukraine benefits from this at all. Their long-range strike campaign at the moment is running effectively, very effectively. And on the battlefield, um, they are actually not doing particularly badly at all. In fact, you're seeing some pretty effective counteroffensives in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, particularly. So, Russia is doing pretty poorly on the battlefield, and especially when it comes to this kind of dueling campaign of deep strikes that both Russia and Ukraine are operating. I would say at this point you could realistically appraise Ukraine's deep strike campaign as being more effective than Russia's, which is incredible, really, for when you consider the relative strength of the two powers. I think it's a sign of weakness, that the fact that he has to kind of go begging to Trump to get some form of temporary ceasefire just so he can again hold this parade in relative peace. It's very, very weak, and it's not what you would expect from the second army in the world, as Russians like to call the Russian army is the second most powerful in the world. Well, it doesn't really look like that at the moment. It looks weak. It looks ineffective, and to be honest, this is also what Putin's internal critics, the patriot bloggers, are saying. They're saying that, Russia looks very weak. They aren't achieving their objectives in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian deep strike campaign, the Ukrainian middle strike campaign, is embarrassing the Russians, and it absolutely is. The Great Patriotic War, as the Russians like to call it, is heavily mythologized in Russian history. Obviously, from their perspective, 1941 to 1945, they don't like to mention the part of the Second World War where they were allied with Nazi Germany and then invaded Poland together and then held a joint victory parade in Brest in Poland. So it's significant for them, and it is very embarrassing that they can't, have this parade which remembers this great moment of Russian triumph. Obviously, they've completely rewritten the part where Ukrainians were a third of the Red Army, and Ukrainians suffered actually some of the heaviest losses in World War II. Um, it's been rewritten to be a almost entirely a purely Russian victory, a purely Russian glorious triumph at this point. It's not this specific incident which is a big blow, but I think what it represents, you have these Ukrainian drones which are able to operate deep in the Russian rear. They've obviously hit a location that the Russians presumed was safe, because you don't base helicopters, which are very valuable assets, in areas that you think are going to be vulnerable to enemy drones. But obviously, in this case, they were. And I think what you're seeing is a result of this determined Ukrainian campaign to attrit Russian air defense assets, which has been going on for, over a year now. They've been using these 5-point FB1, FB2 drones and a bunch of others to hit Russian air defense assets, which are extremely expensive, difficult to produce, even more difficult now Russia is under a bunch of international sanctions. And yeah, you're seeing the result of this. One thing Putin is very, very good at is the controlling the internal repressive environment inside Russia. He's built this system to protect his power, and it is very good at protecting his power. I do think you're seeing rumblings of discontent, but you're not seeing that openly calling for Putin to go, for example. You're seeing the kind of good Tsar, bad boyars situation where people are saying, well, if Putin knew about this stuff, he'd do something about it. People are generally very smart in their criticism. They know exactly how far they can go inside Russia, so you can criticize the people around Putin, but you can't criticize Putin himself.
Что происходило в 30-е годы в Европе, мы тоже знаем. Шла активная милитаризация, прежде всего Германии, германского фашизма, но, значит, естественно, к войне...
He's kind of a comic figure at this point. He comes out with these very bellicose threats, and just people just ignore him because he says this over and over again. I remember back in 2022, he was claiming that if Ukraine struck targets inside Crimea, there would be a nuclear response. Ukraine struck targets in Crimea. What did Medvedev do? He just deleted his tweet. So he's not a serious person. He's this kind of slightly ridiculous figure that even the kind of Russian patriot community don't take seriously at this point. I mean, yeah, it's interesting that the role that the Brits hold in the Russian psyche, at least the Russian psyche in the Kremlin, they seem to think we have this kind of overarching role in world politics. They think, for example, that we planned the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk because they think that the Ukrainians couldn't have come up with this quite effective incursion into Russian territory on their own. And they've always kind of viewed us as having this weird outsized, almost kind of like Bond villain role in controlling the events but of the world behind the scenes. And it's almost flattering in a way, but unfortunately it's not realistic. So, I mean, of course the king's going to get involved in politics. Monarchs have always got involved in, especially international politics. I don't, yeah, I mean, he probably struggles to imagine the head of state getting involved in that way because nobody would probably dare to do that inside Russia. I don't think any foreign leader would come to Russia and lecture Putin because obviously that's not something the Russians would put up with. And yeah, I mean, in regards to the Americans, I mean, they are kind of unstable, let's be honest. But I don't think Russia gets to kind of point fingers at that because essentially the instability inside the American system is a product of the democratic nature of the American system, right? And okay, democracies are going to be unstable from time to time because you have divergence of opinions. You don't have a state which criminalizes opinion. You don't have a state which, imprisons people if they have a different sort of opinion, which is what Russia is. It's a totalitarian police state. So, you can't have this kind of free and fair exchange of views.